My name is Dr. Jonathan Kirkup. I'm the interim head of department at the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University, and welcome to this evening session looking at Northern Ireland and the peace process. So I'm happy to welcome, I'll start at the end, Dr. Thomas Leahy, the senior lecturer in British and Irish politics at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Cardiff. So Thomas, his research area of interest is in Irish politics, and particularly Irish republicanism, and his first book, The Intelligence War Against the IRA, published by Cambridge University Press, won the Brian Farrell Book Prize for the Irish Political Studies Association in 2017. So next on the panel is Michelle Gildernew, the former Sinn Féin Member of Parliament for Fermanagh South Tyrone between 2001 and 2015, and again between 2017 and 24, and also member of the Northern Ireland Assembly between 1998 2012, and then again between 2016 and 17. And Michelle was the former Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development in the Northern Ireland Executive. Last on the panel is Professor Jonathan Tonge. John is Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool and author of multiple books, which I have in my office, on DUP, UUP, Alliance, Sinn Féin, SDLP. He's also a contributor to BBC Northern Ireland and the Belfast Telegraph. This session is funded by GW4. GW4 is a organisation that supports universities at Cardiff, Exeter, Bath and Bristol, and they funded us very graciously for the Ireland and Ireland Contemporary History and Politics Network. And if you're interested in the other videos, then you can go to that website and see the other recordings across this series. Right, so I'll hand over to Thomas just to introduce us.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along on what is what night is it? Monday night. Okay, so hopefully this will be a good Monday night, interesting discussion for you. What we thought we'd do to begin with, just give you a brief overview, conflict, peace process, politics in North of Ireland, just to get you up to speed for anyone who's new to it. So conflict commences in 1969. Irish Republicans saw the undemocratic nature of partition by the British government and Ulster Unionist British Protestants from 1920 as a long-term catalyst, and actually right back in Irish history they would have seen as long-term catalysts of the conflict. Scholars generally agree the devolved British Protestant Ulster Unionist government in Belfast, known as Stormont, thereafter implemented widespread discrimination against Northern nationalists, in other words Irish nationalists living in the north of Ireland or Northern Ireland, whatever you want to call it, before 1969. Civil rights movement emerged in 1960s but met with Unionist resistance. So you've got intercommunal clashes emerging by August 1969. That leads to British troops entering. In my personal opinion, quite quickly, they turned on the Irish nationalist community to prevent a two-front conflict. By 1972, some indiscriminate British security operations saw a sizable minority of Irish Catholics join the Irish Republican Army, which is referred to as the IRA after this. The IRA and its political wing, Sinn Féin, believed steps towards Irish unity was the best way to achieve equality on the island of Ireland. Peace process emerged inclusive of all sides by the 1990s due to, in my view, a political and military stalemate. By 1998, the major parties to the conflict, other than the Democratic Unionist Party, signed the Good Friday Agreement in that year. It implemented power sharing, started police reform, prisoner releases, and more in that period. In politics today, you have five parties primarily. Sorry, my voice has gone for some strange reason now. Sinn Féin, so it's the five main parties. We'll talk about different ones tonight. First one is Sinn Féin, the Irish Republican All-Ireland Party who seek Irish unification. Second, you've got the Democratic Unionist Party and the Ulster Unionist Party who represent the British Protestant population primarily, want to keep Northern Ireland British. There's differences between the two, which we'll probably touch on tonight. Next up, you've got the Social Democratic and Labour Party who want Irish unification in the medium term, I would say, which is different to Sinn Féin. And lastly, the Alliance Party, a liberal, non-unionist and non-nationalist party who claim to be agnostic on the Irish unity question. So I'll hand back to John then for questions for the panel.
Right, so we'll start with some questions to the panel, and then towards the end we'll have a Q&A session. So the first question takes us to the Good Friday Agreement from 1998. And I suppose what we'd like to know from the panel is, looking at the institutions that were set up, as Thomas kind of laid out there, there were three main strands to the way that the Good Friday Agreement was set up. There was the Assembly, the power-sharing executive, the North-South Ministerial Council, and the British and Irish Council. And we're interested in sort of the positives and I suppose some of the negatives about how it was set up and how it was envisaged. And I don't know, Michelle, do you want to start?
Okay, well, I suppose the Good Friday Agreement is over 25 years old now. Was finalised in 1998. There were three strands to the Good Friday Agreement. The strand one was the institution in the north, which is now sits in Stormont, and the Assembly and Executive and the committees that come out of that. Strand two were the north-south arrangements, primarily the North-South Ministerial Council, and strand three then was the British Irish. So the British Irish Council, no, the keep me right here, British Irish Council, come out of that. So basically, when we started, there were 108 MLAs representing, I think, 17 constituencies. There's now, that's reduced a wee bit. And the executive primarily was, at the beginning, was 10 ministers, first and deputy first minister, which the roles were co-equal, and that's important. So while their names were different, their roles were identical. And there are now 10 ministers and 2 junior ministers, and including first and deputy first ministers. In the Good Friday, in the St Andrews Agreement, that there was a wee bit of tweaking done to that arrangement. Martin McGuinness at the time, and again, the context to this is significant. Martin McGuinness offered to change the first and deputy first ministers to co-equal first ministers, and that was rejected by the DUP, who were the biggest party in unionism at that time. So we now have a situation where for years the first minister was a unionist and the deputy first minister was a nationalist, and last February Michelle O'Neill was installed as the first Republican first minister, and that was a seismic shift in terms of politics in the north. But the Assembly has limped quite often to this point. We celebrated 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement last year. Senator George Mitchell and presidents and prime ministers and Taoiseach and all come up to Belfast, and we had a great couple of days talking about it. Ultimately, I suppose we're not where we thought we'd be 25, 26 years ago. There's been a whole lot of stops and starts, and for various different reasons, but it's an imperfect situation, but it's a lot better than what we had. And I think as Republicans, as Irish Republicans, we saw the Good Friday Agreement as a vehicle, a catalyst for moving us forward towards our primary objective, which is constitutional change on the island of Ireland. And I suppose Unionists saw it as something that would keep them within the Union. And we've had to try and work our way into the future with that difference between us. So, it's a quick summary.
John?
Yeah, I mean, if we start, before I look at the institutions, I mean, just look at the Good Friday Agreement itself. It was an honourable compromise after years of struggle. As Michelle has indicated in her answer, Republicans didn't look on it as a settlement. They call it the Good Friday Agreement because it's an agreement, and in some ways it was an agreement to differ over constitutional futures, but place those differences in a peaceful setting. And all sides had to compromise. I mean, if you look at the compromises, you can debate who compromised the most, but there's no doubt all sides compromised. Sinn Féin didn't get a united Ireland, but they weren't compromising on their constitutional ambition. It was just that it was placed on a longer finger than they wanted. Unionists had to suffer painful medicine, given that 2/3 of the prisoners released were from the IRA, and plenty of Unionists didn't like that. There was a reason why the DUP made electoral progress on the back of opposition to the Good Friday Agreement. The British government, those of us of a certain age remember Margaret Thatcher denouncing Irish Republicans as common criminals, but her successor, John Major, started paving the way for a peace process, and Tony Blair didn't treat the IRA as common criminals. You don't release common criminals en masse after 2 years. After 2 years, which was the deal. All paramilitary prisoners, provided their organisations remained on ceasefire, were released within 2 years of the Good Friday Agreement. The Irish government had to compromise. It gave up its constitutional claim to the north and replaced it with an aspiration. So again, the aspiration remained. So every single side had to compromise. And in terms of the institutions, I mean, the idea that everyone was going to live happily ever after was pure fantasy. have a look at, we don't want to get all academic early on, plenty of time for that later, but, consociation or power sharing institutions, they're vulnerable wherever you look. They're vulnerable enough in Belgium, which didn't have the acute divisions that Northern Ireland stroke the north of Ireland, whichever you prefer, has. Lebanon, Bosnia, this was always going to be a very difficult compromise. I think in terms of reforming those institutions, and I'm conscious, we don't want to sort of preempt a question that's coming up. I think some things could be done. I mean, I think the co-first minister one that Michelle mentioned probably was a wasted opportunity, but I don't think it matters hugely. And I think I would change the system whereby you have to designate straight away as either a nationalist, a unionist, or a pretty reductionist other label, which really annoys the Alliance Party because they don't like being dismissed as others. You could move to a system of weighted majority voting in which you had to have the support of, say, 70% of the Assembly for a measure. So there would have to be cross-community support for a measure. So there are reforms that can usefully be looked at. But let's face it, there was no alternative to the Good Friday Agreement, certainly not at the time. It was that honourable compromise. And it's one that, people might criticise it, but no one's ever come up with a truly viable alternative. Certainly not in 1998. But, people see it differently. David Trimble thought he was shoring up the Union in perpetuity when he signed it. I don't think anyone envisaged, and the last thing you want to be listening to is political scientists predicting the future. I don't think anyone saw Sinn Féin becoming the largest party.
We did.
Within a quarter of a century. yeah, Sinn Féin, no one else did. And that's a game changer. And again, just the final point is, people criticise Northern Ireland's power sharing institutions as too rigid. Well, they're not that rigid. I mean, if you compare them to equivalents like in Lebanon, where you have a fixed number, we know the next result of the Lebanese election, there'll be 64 Christians and 64 Muslims elected. Northern Ireland's not like that. Sinn Féin has become the largest party, right? Albeit it's not a system based upon majoritarianism. So things can change, things are changing, and we don't know the ultimate constitutional direction of the Good Friday Agreement.
Okay. Great. Myself. Okay, yeah, so I think... were they positive? Yes, I think in various ways. I think when you look at compulsory power sharing between the largest unionist and nationalist parties, I mean, that was important from the situation, what had developed into the conflict, when you used to have Protestant majority rule, unionist majority rule. And then, as we said, scholars wouldn't dispute that there was various acts of discrimination by the previous Protestant majority rule government. So I think power sharing was important in that sense, in terms of and as we've spoken about here on the panel, like weighted majorities and then cross-community voting. So usually cross-community votes are used on what could be like controversial issues, flags, parades, police, etc. So you won't have that situation again developing where one group is able to essentially discriminate against another. So I think power sharing is really positive in that sense. And I think also it's interesting now with demographics altering and nationalism, certainly electorally, if you look at it, Sinn Féin's gone up to first place, unionism's gone down in terms of the DUP is the largest unionist party to second. That kind of the cross-community voting mechanism is important because it future-proofs it in the sense that now the situation might be reversed, where nationalism might be atop unionism. Again, there's not a concern that you're going to get back to like discriminatory legislation going through because that system will prevent that from happening. I think other things are important, like the North-South Ministerial Council recognising, Irish nationalists as linked to like brethren essentially in the Republic, and that link between the All-Ireland framework for them. And it's important in terms of for the SDLP, but I think Sinn Féin as well in the longer term in getting involved in the peace process. The self-determination principle as well, I think that was quite important in terms of the British government conceding in 1993, Downing Street Declaration, and again in 1998 saying, do you know what, it's for the people of Ireland separately but concurrently North and South, they'll decide what happens, not the British government. And actually in an earlier conversation me and Michelle are involved in, made the point, if you look at, say, for Basque nationalists in the Basque country, they don't have the right for self-determination from Spain. So I think sometimes that can be, overlooked, that is something in the UK framework that's important. And I think that's why actually one of the key reasons that Northern Ireland hasn't essentially had a big return to conflict, etc., because that has been conceded. Having said all that, I do think there's some issues, and the issues to me, I'll just pick out two that seem to stand out. North-South Ministerial Council, I think in its initial years as well, you know, for nationalists, SDLP and Sinn Féin, about how much Unionists are investing in this, particularly the DUP. And obviously it's contingent on power sharing operating. And you know, in that period when we went into, during COVID, when the Assembly goes down again in like 2021, you know, the North-South Ministerial Council could have played a particularly important role, an all-Ireland role in terms of, you know, COVID didn't stop at the border and then kind of go on holidays. So I think that would have given a framework for when you have crisis like that, how you can actually bring people together. But you know, again, I think there can be things built in, so it can't be freestanding and make decisions that the majority of the politicians in the Republic and the North don't want in place. And the other thing that, for me, like reform, the kind of Brexit situation, you know, the British government, when the Assembly collapses, the British government doesn't call direct rule. So this is kind of like weird in-between situations, like not kind of direct rule, but not direct rule, because they wouldn't call it direct rule. And, you know, that led to the situation where civil servants can't make decisions, they can't pass legislation, it's just what was on the books. And I think that showed the problem, arguably you could say in the longer term in the Irish government, when your guarantors of the peace settlement at times might interact with the politics in the situation. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I suppose if we take it chronologically, then we have the Good Friday Agreement, and then by 2006 there's the St Andrews Agreement. So the next question is in relation to that, really, which is I don't know whether one of you wants to maybe explain, when you're answering the question, to explain a little bit what the St Andrews Agreement is. Don't all have to do that, but maybe who do I pick on? Who do I pick on for this? But I suppose around the St Andrews Agreement, so it's an agreement between DUP and Sinn Féin. The question really is, like, why did it happen? How did it happen? And you know, what was the outcome of it? What's the consequence of the St Andrews Agreement? But do you want to start, John?
Okay, very briefly, the St Andrews Agreement was a change in the rules of how the First and Deputy First Minister were elected, in the sense that it went from being reliant upon a cross-community vote to one where the largest party and the largest designation, which was subsequently changed to the largest party. The largest party would nominate the First Minister. And that, I think, is the clue as to why the DUP did a remarkable conversion and came around to supporting the... well, DUP has never explicitly said it supports the Good Friday Agreement. In effect, St Andrews was only a modification to the Good Friday Agreement, and so by supporting St Andrews, you are in effect accepting the Good Friday Agreement. Why? Well, the DUP had become the largest party in Northern Ireland, stroke the north of Ireland. The DUP wanted a taste of power, and above all, Ian Paisley wanted to end his political career as First Minister. So I think there's a fairly straightforward explanation as to why the DUP signed up to St Andrews, with two important political caveats. One, the context had changed. The IRA formally called off its armed campaign in 2005 and instructed all its volunteers to pursue purely political means. So the context had changed. And the IRA completed decommissioning. So those rows that had dogged and collapsed, contributed to the collapse of the institutions in 2002, those rows had rather passed. The other big thing about St Andrews was that Sinn Féin committed to calling a conference in January 2007 to support the police service in Northern Ireland, because that was an untenable position. You couldn't really have a party in government that wasn't supporting the, I won't call Northern Ireland a state, but the region, whatever you want to call Northern Ireland, its police force. I don't think that long term that was a sustainable position. So that allowed then the DUP to in effect, you know, support all that it had previously renounced.
Do you want to?
Well, yeah, I suppose it was a step in the process, and I think, as somebody who was involved in politics at the very beginning of the peace process, in terms of, I was the Sinn Féin rep in London during the Good Friday negotiations, so I was liaising with the parties in London. One or two notable exceptions in the Conservative Party, mostly Labour and Lib Dem MPs would have engaged with me, but also trade unions, and got to know Bob Crow from the not CWU, what was the one he was in?
The railway.
Yeah, the RMT.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we had great friends. I had great friends in London. I had great support, and people like Jeremy Corbyn's still a personal friend, but you know, John McDonnell and Ken McGuinness, and there were loads of people that would have given us space in London. And so I was working as part of that, got elected then in the election after the Good Friday Agreement and became an MLA at that stage. And as John has very helpfully pointed out, you know, flip-flopped in and out of the various different institutions. But I suppose I felt in 1998 that we would continue just to make progress. And I suppose, if I'm honest, I've seen the dead hand of unionism quite a few times over that period, trying to stymie progress. And I'd said earlier that that period when Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams were at the diamond-shaped table meeting that it's talked about now, we can't have tables in the north because they're, you know, if they're not equal and everybody, it's very complicated and convoluted. But we had the diamond-shaped table meeting. We set up DeHunt. After that, ran DeHunt, set up an executive. I became the Agriculture and Rural Development Minister under Ian Paisley as First Minister, Martin McGuinness as Deputy First Minister. And ironically, that was probably the 4 most stable years in our 100-year history from devolution. And I'm not sure if that's a badge of honour or something completely different, but we worked very hard to make that executive work, and I think we had to prove that politics could work because it had been so fractured between then and Good Fridays, or the St Andrews. So there's still lots of outstanding issues. We don't have a Bill of Rights. That's one of the most vexed that the parts of the Good Friday Agreement 26 years later still haven't been implemented, which is a disgrace. And there's areas that I felt would have organically, and you know, our North-South Ministerial Council and the areas of cooperation, North and South, could have expanded beyond. We could have expanded one into animal health, we could have went into climate change, we could have went into, you know, the COVID and post-pandemic planning and all of that. So there's an awful lot of things on the island of Ireland that we could do better by working together, and at the minute we're kind of stuck. So I don't know that any kind of constitutional arrangement that still has, well, as an Irish Republican, obviously my ultimate objective is unification. But I genuinely at this stage, and maybe I'm just cynical and jaded, but a 6-county situation is never, ever, ever going to work. We had, as Thomas pointed out at the beginning, that period up until 1969 saw wholesale discrimination. We saw the army coming in, we saw policies, British government policies like the shoot to kill policy, there was collusion. When we look back in history at the conflict in Ireland, and I'd go back 800 years, Thomas, no harm, but if we look back on the conflict of Ireland, it has been a very difficult period of time, and the 6-county arrangement hasn't worked in over 100 years. It will never work as far as I'm concerned, and we have to work together and find a way of planning and preparing and making it easy for people to make that transition.
Okay, my thoughts on this would be, I don't think there was really an alternative at that point, and I think that's for Sinn Féin to a lesser extent, which I'll talk about now, for the DUP, I think in particular. So on that front with Sinn Féin, I think the thing for them at that point, you know, they were well aware there wasn't a majority for like Irish unity and moving towards that at that point when you get to 2006-07. So therefore, you know, working, as Michelle has said, you know, within the agreement and then building from there was probably going to be the best way forward for the party. Having said that, I actually think that, I think you can go back probably even to the 70s, 80s, certainly the Republican leadership realised that there'd have to be some form of political compromise and was keen to have negotiations. And they certainly realised that by 1998 as a Sinn Féin as a party. And you see actually in 2004, there's an attempt to try and resurrect power sharing, which collapsed for a while between 2002 up to 2006-07 with the St Andrews Agreement. There was an attempt already by Sinn Féin in 2004, a place called Leeds Castles, near where I grew up for a while, Kent, in South East England. Yeah, and they were willing to finish off what did the DUP need ticked off the list to go into power sharing. And they were willing to complete IRA decommissioning if power sharing, police reform, demilitarisation by the British Army, so pulling out British troops from the streets onto back to barracks, and security infrastructure was pulled down, which wasn't needed. So they could have completed it then, but the DUP said at this meeting, no, we need the photographs. Got out photographs of the IRA's final act of decommissioning. And showing that, Jerry Adams would say that in his memoirs, and Jonathan Powell, who's a chief negotiator for Tony Blair in Northern Ireland, said this, that the photographs issue is what stopped that working. I think that in 2005, there's various pressures from various events on the IRA and Sinn Féin to complete decommissioning. But having said that, two other things I think that were key was that the British government, a key thing that Sinn Féin and the Republican community wanted was this idea of demilitarisation. So withdrawal of British troops back to barracks and ending security infrastructure related to the conflict. And as soon as the IRA says in 2005, that's the end of our campaign, officially, plus they do the last decommissioning act, then suddenly the Labour government, I think this was literally the following day, that the Secretary of State, Peter Haynes, said, okay, British troops will definitely be out by 2007. So what I'm saying, I suspect from looking at decommissioning up to 2001 for state papers, I think that's choreographed. So basically there's a kind of quid pro quo that if you deliver, then we deliver. I make the point, which I said earlier in our conversation as well, that is not how the Good Friday Agreement set up, how decommissioning would work. It was supposed to be in tandem with things like demilitarisation. But nonetheless, I think that was important. The other thing that's important, and I picked this up from John's book, actually, on the DUP, and then Jonathan Powell also said this in his work, which is the point that once the IRA decided that's the end of our campaign, then the pressure's on the DUP because there's this kind of threat of a Plan B. And Plan B was more Irish government involvement in some form of British direct rule over Northern Ireland. And the DUP did not want that under any circumstance. They didn't like any Irish government influence, even from the mid-80s, which was just a consultative role in the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So I think that did put the pressure on the DUP and made them think, which direction is this going to go? Because being the largest party and having an influence on power would have disappeared if they didn't go into government. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so the next question is around, we've touched on it quite a lot actually, about the collapsing of the executive, and without wanting to go historically through the various collapses, because there's quite a lot of them and I don't want to go one by one through each of those, I suppose the question is maybe a bit broader, is about why do you think that the executive just has collapsed in the way that it has, the number of times that it has? There are specific reasons, but this talk's taking place in Wales, so devolution happened at the same time in Wales. Obviously the positions are very, very different, but there's a sort of trait right in Northern Ireland about the collapsing of executives. So who wants to start?
I might go first on that one. And again, we touched on this earlier. So when the Good Friday Agreement the ink was drying on the Good Friday Agreement, Sinn Féin went on the road. We invited the ANC over to the north of Ireland. We brought them into the prisons to talk to the prisoners. We went to meetings where there was 400 people in a room. We went to meetings where there were 4 around a kitchen table. And we basically talked our base through the Good Friday Agreement. And I remember Mitchell McLaughlin saying at a meeting in Toonbridge in County Antrim, read the Good Friday Agreement, then read it again. This is not a Republican document, but it's a template. It's a catalyst for us to move forward. So Sinn Féin had worked very hard at providing positive leadership, explaining, answering questions, having those challenging conversations behind closed doors and bringing people with them. Now, every stage of the process, and we've lost people, hemorrhaged people over the years, and the policing debate and different things, we've lost people. But we've worked really, really hard to bring as many people with us as we could. And unity within the party was very, very important. And I think because we had a realistic perception of what the Good Friday Agreement was. It wasn't a Republican document. It wasn't, as others have said, the be-all and end-all for Republicans, but it was a vehicle to move us forward. And unionism didn't do that. And somebody said at the time, when the ink was drying, Sinn Féin went on the road and unionists went to bed, went to sleep. And they just took it easy and had a nice wee break at Easter, whereas we were working our backsides off to try and make sure that as many people as possible came with us on this journey. And I think that's the difference. And I've sat in assembly committees with DUP and UUP members. I have listened to the things that they've said. I've listened to, I remember one particularly difficult period of suspension. Myself and Conor Murphy were on a committee, and Diane Dodds was on the same committee. And me and Conor came out one beautiful Friday afternoon. The sun was splitting the trees, and Conor looked at me and he goes, "What did we do to get put on that committee?" There's a word in between, you can figure that out. Like, but it was hard work. And that committee, we spent hours in that meeting discussing the minutes from the previous meeting, and we never got them agreed. Hours later. There was nearly, you'd thought there was a direction to the DUP Assembly members, put the dead hand on this, don't let them go any further forward, just keep this closed down and don't let it progress. And that's how I felt as a young person sitting in there wasting my time, well, spending my time in sweaty rooms in Stormont when I could be at home with my wains. And it was just, you felt that there was while our raison d'etre was to keep going, to keep moving forward, theirs was to slow it down, to stop it, to stall it, to stop us from making progress. And I think that was a big part of the number of suspensions that we had over the period.
Thomas, you've kind of gone last.
Okay. I think it's just on the question, I've said this before, if some students are here, you'll probably be bored because I've said this in class before. If I haven't, then it's going to spoil the next couple of weeks of lectures. Which is that I think in Wales, right, living here in the Senedd, I think if you tried to get Plaid Cymru, the Tories, Labour, soon to be Reform, I imagine to get seats in next year's, I think there is an election next year, isn't there? The Senedd, yeah. I don't think that would work fantastic either. So in fairness, I would say in Belfast, I think that's part of this, that you've got that's a really tricky situation working with parties, and you've got a constitutional question in there, which, okay, it wouldn't have the same veracity, certainly not at the moment here. So I think that's one part, I think. So judging its stability, I think, in terms of, and like longevity and what it's trying to achieve, I think it's always, has it reduced the conflict in terms of like political violence? Yes, quite significantly. And that, in a sense, I think is an achievement. Yeah, so that's point one. Point two, I'm going to talk about like from 2017, so why particularly it's been up and down in that period. So just two factors, DUP and British government, and I'll try and cover both briefly. DUP, I think when you look back at this is how I made sense of the Brexit thing in my head with the DUP. I think that they were always anti like European integration, so the European Economic Community, and later on the EU. Because I think, well, there's one anecdotal reason, in the 1980s, Ian Paisley Sr. was saying, there's X number of Roman Catholics in Europe compared to Protestants, so let's try. So I think that was some factor, but the real reason I think for most of the DUP was just the fact that it's seen as diluting sovereignty, diluting borders, and that was, not something you want if you want Northern Ireland to remain within the UK. I then also think it kind of then coincided, that belief, post-98 with demographic changes, where the Unionist population is gradually going down and nationalist population is catching up in numbers. Plus then in the 2010s, to show kind of the feelings about this, Belfast City Hall Alliance, the SDLP and Sinn Féin agreed that we won't fly the Union Jack 365 days a year, and it'd be more in line with what happens on public buildings in the rest of the UK. And then the DUP opposed this, loyalist groups opposed it, etc. So what I think then happened with Brexit, in fairness to the DUP, I think it was a genuine belief that this is an opportunity to try and make it clear this is Northern Ireland, which is in the UK, and that's the Republic, and it's separate from here. The reason they were able to do that is because obviously the political situation in London with Theresa May's government relying on them, because Northern Ireland voted Remain, like 55%. When Theresa May's government, relied on the confidence and supply measure of the DUP, I mean, if I was in the DUP with those beliefs sitting there, I think this is great, and you would collapse power sharing. You think, I don't want to particularly share powers with parties that have a constitutional belief I don't believe in. So I think that's what then happened, but of course, in a sense, they then get their fingers burnt, because once Boris Johnson comes in after Theresa May, and then we were talking earlier, like the YouGov polls, for example, at that time were showing the majority Conservative members, so Conservative Party members, were saying it's fine to cut Northern Ireland adrift if it means we get our hard Brexit. And then essentially that's what happens, and they do cut the DUP adrift. Northern Ireland gets essentially, in my view, all but named special status in the EU. So then I think they go back into power sharing. They don't then like the arrangements that happen in terms of trade, etc., basically an economic border in the Irish Sea. So they collapse power sharing again, or pull out of it in 2022, was that? Or 2021, yeah. And then I think, last point on this is that, and I like Jonathan Powell's book says this, and that Sinn Féin and the DUP are very shrewd negotiators in relation to what happened with setting up power sharing in the early 2000s. And I think the DUP, in some sense, just overplayed their hand. You couldn't do that at that kind of macro level against the British government and the EU and sign an agreement to try and get them to pick bits of it out they didn't like. So I think that's essentially why they go back into power sharing. because I don't see what other vehicle they've got. So collapses in the recent period, I would say, were those two things. Yeah.
I think there's three possible answers to this question, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is the whole range, a whole myriad of reasons, individual reasons for each collapse. And I'm not going to give a blow-by-blow account. I just want to highlight a couple without duplicating what's been said. The second possible answer is power sharing doesn't work. You look at divided societies globally, they tend to collapse. They tend to be chronically unstable. And the third possibility is just Northern Ireland doesn't work, which I think, without putting words in Michelle's mouth, is where she would go with it. So, yeah, okay, dealing with one, as I say, I don't want to give a blow-by-blow account, but it was almost inevitable there would be disruptions to power sharing coming out of conflict, a society coming out of conflict. And remember, the rows over decommissioning did destabilise the Assembly and Executive in the early years, almost inevitably. Remember, there were very different positions. The British government wanted the IRA to decommission in advance of any settlement. The IRA told them to get lost because that would look like a surrender. Senator Mitchell, brokering the talks, said, how about decommissioning in parallel to the talks? The IRA said no to that. So you had the third position, which was, we will decommission at some point. And of course, decommissioning was fudged in the text of the agreement. So decommissioning dogged for years. So you had conflict-ending measures dogging the first stage of devolution. And then you get a whole myriad of reasons. I mean, the amount of reasons is just phenomenal. Everything from Brexit, which contributed to the 2017 Sinn Féin walkout, but there was also Arlene Foster and RHI, which was a biggie. And then you get Brexit from the Unionist perspective. And I agree with Thomas. I mean, I was there at the DUP conference that day when Boris Johnson, it's the first case of someone launching their party leadership bid at someone else's party conference. I mean, he went to the DUP conference and said Theresa May is basically betraying you, and, you know, no British Prime Minister should put a border in the Irish Sea. And then he agreed a deal a year later, which did exactly that once he'd got the top job. So a whole range of destabilising reasons. And, you know, we can talk about other stuff that we're not mentioned, where the British government has had to legislate as well on same-sex marriage, on abortion, on Irish language. So, you know, there's an awful lot there. No wonder, in some ways. The miracle was that it has been in existence just over 60% of the time, of the political institutions, in some respects. The second one is, does this thing work globally? I mean, name me a stable power-sharing consociational government in the world, and, you know, fingers on one hand. You know, these things are prone to collapse because you've got historic, dearly felt, constitutional and other rivalries. They're not going to dissipate. And so you've got very different constitutional ambitions. They are hard to manage. If it was that easy, there wouldn't have been a conflict in these places in the first place. So we perhaps expect too much of this. And then there's a third possibility that, look, just Northern Ireland doesn't work. It's, you know, economically, it's not sustainable. You know, we talk about Wales and we talk about Scotland, and they have financial issues of their own. But let's face it, the vast, vast bulk of NI's budget comes direct from the UK Treasury. Its level of, you know, on a lot of economic indicators, and I know that Pete Shirlow in the Institute of Irish Studies, colleague in another department at Liverpool, would take issue with this and say Northern Ireland's economic prospects are much more rosy. But it's, you know, is it a self-sustaining polity and economy of its own? And I think that remains open to question. So, you know, there are different reasons why you've had these collapses in power sharing, the much more general ones and the specifics. And I think, you know, we did an essay on this, a blend of them.
So the next section we're going to look at is two specific questions. The first one from Michelle, and then the second one from John, which you've touched on a little bit, Michelle, which is about the success of Sinn Féin, on how, when the Good Friday Agreement was formed, the SDLP were the largest nationalist party. But since then, progressively, Sinn Féin have taken that mantle. So it's a question of how did you achieve that, maybe in the north of Ireland, and then what's happened in the south as well?
Okay, well, I suppose when we went into the Assembly at the beginning, the SDLP obviously had more elected reps than ourselves. I remember, I think there were 5 women, 15 women altogether, 5 of them were Sinn Féin. We went into the chamber and the Unionist parties used to catcall and abuse us, and there was like a sliding scale of the women that they hated, and the top of the list were the Sinn Féin women, and Barbara de Bruyne was at the very top of that list because she was an Irish language speaker, a Gaeilgeoir, and she was born in the south, and they really hated her. And so there was the 5 Shinner women, and then Breeze Rogers, who was also a Gael Court and SDLP woman, then the rest of the SDLP, then the Women's Coalition. And when all this heckling and catcalling, and they used to be going moo across because we were all cows apparently, and they showed themselves in such a bad light, and the women from the Unionist benches were adding into it. It was crazy. So Sinn Féin were, I suppose, not afraid to call that kind of behaviour out. Seamus Mallon was the Deputy First Minister at the time, along with David Trimble, and there would nearly have been there was more commonality between those two parties than there would have been between ourselves and the SDLP, just in terms of class issues and how we treated people and all the rest of it. And I think Sinn Féin went in, and I know my personal point of view is it's hearts and minds. Everywhere I go, if I'm sitting beside somebody on a plane and I think they've got a different constitutional point of view than me, their ears will be bleeding by the time we land, because I'll have talked to them about all the reasons why they should change their position. But it's about hearts and minds. It's about bringing people with us, and we've worked really, really hard to bring people with us. I think the SDLP just presumed they'd always be there, and they didn't work quite as hard. We also had very strident policies on a number of things, and some of those collapses that the boys have talked about, RHI was one of them. Sinn Féin was certainly, at that stage, Martin McGuinness was Deputy First Minister and was very strident on it. But we were also, the Irish Language Act was something that was really holding us back. There was, right now, Casement Park is holding us back. And I think the fact that we were happy to go into an election as abstentionist MPs, that we were happy to take on, you know, the British and Irish government, we weren't part of anybody's cabal, and we weren't sister party to the Labour or anything else. We were not afraid to challenge whoever needed to be challenged. And the SDLP's connections with Labour, and then they sort of flip-flopped between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and they went into an arrangement, a confidence and supply arrangement or something with Fianna Fáil. That went down really badly with nationalists. And the fact that the SDLP take their seats in Westminster, are part of that system, doesn't, nationalists don't love it. People, even if they're not Republican, they don't feel that people going to London and taking an oath to the Queen or now to the King and taking an oath of allegiance to their heirs and successors, that doesn't sit well with nationalists anyway. Now, there's a whole lot of other reasons why we don't take our seats, but that's one of them. But the SDLP don't seem to have a problem with that. And I remember Tony Benn, God rest him, would have loved us to have took, and he'd have tried to say, if we could get rid of the oath, would you not take your seat? And I'd be going, Tony, no, even if you get rid of the oath. He was going like, just cross your fingers behind your back. And I was going, no, we're not taking the oath. But that's not the only reason we're not taking our seats. I'm just trying to explain that. So that whole abstentionism thing. So the SDLP would have been more comfortable in an executive with the UUP, and there would have been probably less conflict between those two parties than when it was us and the DUP, and we were much further apart. But we worked harder, not just us and Martin McGuinness in particular, but Ian Paisley did really have that, I wouldn't call it a Damascene conversion, but he definitely moved significantly. And we're also in government, we're an All-Ireland party, and that again is an area that the SDLP have probably suffered from. And Fianna Fáil have tried to come up to the north and have tried to set up common in the north and all the rest of it, and that has fallen flat on its face too. But because we're an All-Ireland party, because we had representatives in every corner in Ireland, because we were seen as the party who were absolutely dyed in the wool in support of unity, where the SDLP were more agnostic at times, and watery is a word I used earlier. But I think that explains why we kept out voting the SDLP. And I think we still need to give that positive leadership that I talked about earlier. We still need to be, not to be afraid of challenging, whether it's government in the south or government in Britain or whatever. And we also worked really, really hard at influencing people in America, people in Europe. So we never rested on our laurels or took what we had for granted. We knew we had to keep pushing and bringing people with us and working and cajoling and persuading and all the rest of it, because at the end of the day, what gets us out of bed every morning is Irish unity. That's why I'm involved in politics, and that's the only thing that we have driving us, and that's a real catalyst for moving forward.
Right, so for John, one aspect that we've talked a lot about the DUP and Sinn Féin. You mentioned at the start that there's also the Alliance, a sort of non-aligned party. So without, obviously you've written non-aligned, so maybe the whole book, but just a bit around, just explaining about, in recent times, Alliance have risen in popularity and had some quite significant success, obviously, particularly at Stormont. Why, how, and what will happen next? Is really the question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there is a book available on this. Scandalously expensively priced by Oxford University Press. Anyway, the rise of Alliance has been an interesting phenomenon in recent times. I suspect that rise has probably plateaued now for various reasons I'll very quickly come on to. Why did the Alliance rise in support, though? Well, I mean, Alliance was a miracle that it was ever born, because the Alliance Party was born in 1970 at a time when Northern Ireland, the North of Ireland, was pulling itself apart. And so for a party to actually get up to 15% of the vote, which Alliance did by the late 1970s, was quite a feat in itself. But then you had Republican hunger strikes and ever more polarisation in some ways. And, Alliance fell to 4%, and they probably, at the 2003 Assembly election, were only within about 500 to 1,000 votes of extinction from the Assembly. So, very bleak years. When we did a membership study of Alliance, we found that no one was joining the party in the 80s, 90s and 2000s. But they revived. Why did they revive? Well, I mean, obviously, creating power-sharing institutions does give a bigger role for local politicians, so you can achieve greater provenance as a party. A very different type of Alliance member these days, though, because when we did a study of Alliance 20 years ago, which we published in an obscure journal because no one gave two hoots about Alliance, we found that the vast bulk of Alliance, only 1 in 6 Alliance members supported a united Ireland. When we did the study a couple of years ago, we found that more members of Alliance supported a united Ireland than support Northern Ireland staying in the UK, albeit there's no overall majority for any constitutional option. So a different type of member. Whereas Alliance was sort of full of liberal Protestants who didn't like what they saw as sectarian aspects of unionism. That was your typical Alliance member. It's changed now. In fact, there's a lot of people of no religion within Alliance. The percentage of Catholics has stayed broadly constant. So a different type of member, a different type of leader as well in a lot of ways. Naomi Long has been a good electoral asset, notwithstanding she loses in East Belfast to Gavin Robinson every general election. But overall, clearly she's been an asset. I think also Alliance was helped by the fact that, Alliance was pro-union. It was explicitly in favour of the union as a party until the Good Friday Agreement, after which Alliance changed its constitution. Previously, Alliance had said Northern Ireland is better off in the UK, A, for religious reasons, basically a Catholic theocracy to the south, we don't want to be part of that, and secondly, for economic reasons. Alliance changed its constitution and said, no, we're neutral on the constitution. It changed it on after the Good Friday Agreement. And you've had a section of unionism that has got tired, I think, or pro-union people who got tired of the UUP and DUP and some of the antics that went on and were prepared to give a vote for Alliance. And also some nationalists saw, when Alliance offices were attacked in 2012 with the Loyalist flags dispute, it was Alliance was getting its offices burnt or bricked. And I think that got a message across, well, Alliance is not actually the old sort of necessarily pro-union party. So there were different reasons why Alliance rose in support. And of course, if you're reluctant to transfer across the divide in a proportional representation, single transferable vote election, assembly election, you won't, if you're a unionist but you won't go across to Republican or nationalist parties, or if you're a nationalist Republican but you won't go across to unionist parties, well, you might contemplate a vote for Alliance in the middle. So, and if you look, about half of Alliance's MLAs, nearly half, were elected on the final count with lower preference vote transfers. So that's a plethora of reasons why Alliance has grown. Can Alliance grow further? the problem with alliances, it's in a good third place at the moment, but the bronze medal in Northern Irish politics is useless, because if you're the top Nationalist Republican Party, you get the first ministership. We get more votes if you get more seats than any other party. Same if you're the largest Unionist party, you get the DFM as at present. What do you get if you're the largest other party or just in third place? You don't get anything. I mean, you don't get anything. So I think Alliance will have a tough job to hold all its seats in the next Assembly election in 2027. Alliance's big problem, it's strong in the eastern Northern Ireland, but go west of the Ban and go to Shall Operate, and Alliance is weak. Alliance is weak the further west you go in the north, and they're aware of that, but I'm not sure that they can necessarily change it. And if you look at the membership as well, it's overwhelmingly concentrated in Down and Antrim. So I think there are structural and geographical barriers to Alliance continue to grow, but it's not going to disappear. It's not going to disappear. I think it will be a significant third, I don't know how to term third force, more sinister connotations in Northern Irish history. A significant third party. Alliance, just one last point on this, because I'm slightly obsessed with this, I know. Alliance wants to change the institutions and really reform. We touched on it before about what sort of reforms could be brought in. I don't get a sense that the British and Irish governments and the largest two parties are massively up for that. I know that Sinn Féin has talked about they're up for reform, and the DUP says we're not wedded to mandatory coalition at all. But I don't get a big sense of momentum behind the changes that Alliance wants to bring in, and without those changes, I think the party could tread water from here on.
So, buy the book, right? For more. So the last question before we go to Q&A is, I suppose, an open question in that your view on the prospects of power sharing in Northern Ireland. So if we go to Thomas first, because you didn't speak in the last round.
Okay. Yeah, I would say, I think longer term looking at it, and that includes if it moves into an all-Ireland framework and a unified state. I remember this actually because Michelle O'Neill was speaking, when was this, at the Senedd, it was definitely pre-COVID, and someone asked, I think it was a student from my course, a question is what would you do about power sharing if there was unification? And her answer was, essentially see north and south what the preference is for keeping that there. And I do think in that respect, it's an interesting question to look at, because I think there's definitely going to be some form of government if there was an all-Ireland state, and I think we talked about this earlier, maybe 10 to 15 years, you look at the demographics, that might well happen. But what I think might happen there, I think there has to be some inbuilt mechanism where unionism has an influence on government. Because I just don't see, obviously unionism isn't up for unification generally, and if it then happens, if they then just become a perpetual minority that doesn't have any kind of influence on what's happening, I don't think they're going to accept that. So I do think in that sense, maybe it might just remain in the north and the power sharing would remain there, even if it was in a unified state in the future. Or certainly, maybe this idea has come from some people who've been Fianna Fáil, but there was an idea, would you have a centralised government in Dublin in a unified state, and then unionism would have, I don't know, a certain percentage linked to government seats or etc. So I do think some form of power sharing, for all the issues it has, I think even if there was a unified state, would be there. Whether that would be in the north, plus there'd be the government in Dublin, or just something that's set up in Dublin, I don't know. And what I would say to that as well is it'd be interesting preferences in this in the Republic of Ireland, because the survey results have always kind of showed since the 1970s onwards, although the Republic, in my personal view from work, tried to distance itself from the conflict and contain it, certainly the Irish government up north as much as possible and ignore it. The population in the south, over 60%, have always backed unification, even during the conflict. The interesting thing is then what form of government and what form of healthcare system, etc. And just on power sharing, I think that's where I think questions would be interesting, because from my perspective in the north, questions such as healthcare system, and just from living in the Republic and experiencing their other healthcare system there, I just think Unionists and Nationalists in the north, there's no way they'd opt into some kind of privatised system that exists in the south. So I think that's the thing, if you did have a form of power sharing in the different parts of the island of Ireland, if there's unification, or if it's just in a centralised government, I think it would be interesting, because, and also electorally, because there's proportional systems in the north and the south, And that will be interesting because I don't think it'll always be so clear-cut on certain questions which way like unionism would back. I think it would create actually quite an interesting situation of coalitions on certain like policy areas. Yeah, so that would be my view. I think that it probably will stay in some form, but a lot of that depends on unionism and how they'd react in future to either situation that develops in the next 10, 15 years in the north, plus if there is a Irish unification poll and it's in favour of doing so, I think they want some influence on government, so I think some form of power sharing would probably remain.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, well, I actually would take it maybe a slightly different view. I think post the constitutional issue being sorted out on the island of Ireland, I think politics in itself across the board will normalise. So a lot of what we're talking about now is the constitutional question, but there's also working class, socialist-leaning left-wing parties on the island, and there are more right-wing parties that would. So we've had to go in and negotiate a number of programme for governments with the DUP, and on a lot of issues we have very different points of views. And equally, when we were in campaigning for the general election in the 26 counties last year, and we were talking about, people were, speculating about what the form of government would look like, and we were saying we would want to discuss a programme for government with, if there was a left-leaning alliance or whatever, politics would converge on class issues more so than on constitutional issues. And I actually think, having worked with both Fine Gael and the DUP, that there's quite a lot of commonality there in terms of where they would want to be. I think some of the things that we were trying to get, I was in a committee, the Social Development Committee back 98, 99, and there was DUP members on it, and they genuinely couldn't understand how anybody could be homeless. And one of the people on the committee, John probably knows who this is, he's an ex-teacher, he had no concept of homelessness and why anybody would be homeless. They don't understand. People come to me, I should have said too when I was talking about the differences between Sinn Féin and the SDLP, we actually work our backsides off, and we work really, really hard. We have a brilliant constituency model, and we work on delivery for our constituents. And loads of unionists have come to me for years. They've voted for me, but they've come to me in constituency offices in Fermanagh, South Rowan, and they have said to me, I don't vote for the DUP because they don't know what poverty, they don't understand poverty. And, so I think there's going to be realignments on the island of Ireland post the constitutional issue getting sorted out, and we will then go into a more realpolitik situation whereby, we have left-leaning parties and we have right-leaning parties, and we have to try and make politics work on the island of Ireland. And where you come in the politics, religion should never have anything to do with politics, but I think it'll have less to do in that context. So.
Okay, well, I want to be objective rather than prescriptive. The last thing Ireland needs, given the last 800 years, is the English guy telling them what to do on the other side of the Irish Sea. So I just want to be analytical. Okay, the future prospects for power sharing. Short term, I don't see any, this famous last words, this could come back to haunt me, I don't see the institutions collapsing anytime soon. The DUP has gone back in. They know they use what little leverage they had in walking out, and I think that everyone accepts this is the least bad system in the short term. That begs the obvious longer question of, well, how long has Northern Ireland got? Is a united Ireland inevitable? Kevin Marr's a good friend of mine, wrote a book, Why United Ireland is Inevitable. I disagree that it's inevitable. I think it's likely, and as someone who's always been sympathetic to United Ireland, it's probably more probable than not in the long term. But Mary Lou McDonald herself said, when she came to speak at Liverpool a few years ago, said, it's not inevitable, we have to work at it. And I still think a border poll is probably further away than many in Sinn Féin would like. The polling gap is closing, and the demographics are in Sinn Féin's favour, but it's still quite a substantial polling lead. If you average across the polls, about 14-point percentage lead. the encouragement for Republicans is there's no longer an overall majority for NI staying in the UK, which is, ought to be of concern for Unionists that you're only getting to 49-50%. Pre-Brexit, that figure was regularly around 65% of people when surveyed in the North said that they wanted Northern Ireland to stay in the UK. So, quite a drop. If I was a member of Sinn Féin, I'd be nice to alliance types, because it's those voters ultimately. It will be those voters, those swing voters. We know how the vast bulk of Sinn Féin and SDLP voters would vote in the border poll. They vote for unity, obviously. With the ones who are up for grabs, the ones who would plug that gap are alliance voters. They're the ones that need to be persuaded. And they might be up for a united Ireland within the European Union. So those are the ones, if you like, the swing voters in this. As Thomas rightly pointed out as well, there's always been majorities in the south. Yeah, you can chip away and say, well, if you add caveats to United Ireland, that majority reduces, and it does. But there's still, and it's always been a slight surprise to me why Irish governments have not had more of a unity agenda in some ways, given that they would be in tune with public opinion. Even Leo Varadkar, when he was Taoiseach, wasn't going to go for unity. Admittedly, he was dealing with a lot of Brexit fallout, I accept that. But it was only after he left office that he became more like that. So I still think a border poll, I've turned 60 and I'm not convinced I'll see United Ireland in my lifetime, although given my lifestyle, that may be a pretty short fuse we're operating on anyway. So it's hard to, I wouldn't like to say when a border poll will happen, but the mere fact, if one is called, that probably does mean the game's up for the Union, because the Secretary of State will push it back as far as they can until, the Secretary of State is only legally obliged to call a border poll when it appears there is a majority in favour of constitutional change. That would obviously be tested in the courts if it appeared there was a majority from all the opinion polls. Of course, we haven't got one of the unsatisfactory things, I know sorry, it's a long answer, but one of the unsatisfactory things about the Good Friday Agreement is that it doesn't provide the criteria by which the Secretary of State should form that judgment. And if you look at election results, Unionists and Nationalists are pretty much neck and neck now. So Hilary Benn is obviously using opinion polls, but he's never explicitly said, well, we're using opinion polls. I think that does put I would never say political scientists were important. That really would be stretching a point. But I think there is an onus upon, if that is going to be the criteria, that we need to have reliable tests of public opinion. Because there are different polling methods producing slightly different results at the moment, if that's the criteria the Secretary of State is using. So there's a plea for political science towards the end.
I couldn't come in with a wee supplementary.
Of course, yeah.
I think we have to look at the Scottish independence referendum, and when you look at the figures that there were at the start of that debate, and then 2 years later, and Scotland got so close, and it was the politics sphere that kind of wrecked it on for independence. So I think, first of all, the debate in itself, you don't need to be 50 plus at the start of the debate. You go into the debate and you discuss it and you take it and figure out and extrapolate figures and all of that, and talk about the health service and talk about the things that we need to see differently. And I also think that there's a big difference, a big shift in so you don't think, John, you'll see a border poll and you're only 60. 4 years' time, Mary Louise Taoiseach, do you think it'll be a different, would you have the exact same point of view at that time? Because I think that's the catalyst for major change.
Briefly in response, I think that will hasten the process. The Sinn Féin government would hasten the process because the prospectus does need to be written. There is no prospectus at the moment. So when we do surveys asking people, do you want a united Ireland? It's understandable a lot of people don't say yes because they've not seen the prospectus, so that they want to see it. But there's only Sinn Féin going to write the prospectus because it's pretty obvious that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are not interested in writing that prospectus. Unionists won't engage with the conversation. So
some of them do.
Some do, but the parties, the Unionist parties, no. The DUP and UUP don't, and certainly not the TUV. So, I think that it is, yourselves alone on that in terms of writing it. And even, I take your point on the SNP got things very, very close, and they came from nowhere because at the start of the campaign. But they produced a 700-page document, and then it just got picked off on one thing about the currency that became the big talking point in that campaign. So it has to be a pretty watertight prospectus. because an awful lot will be thrown back, that's for sure, in a campaign.
And some of the things that they faltered on, we've got guarantees. So back into the EU, for example,
Yeah.
that's another very attractive, as you said yourself, with Alliance voters. And by the way, we're just not nice to Alliance voters, we're nice to everybody.
Especially nice. That.
So let's move on now to Q&A.
If you can explain where once a little more the relationship between, especially the DUP and Sinn Féin with Europe, also starting from the Good Friday Agreement, and if you think that, especially the European Parliament, since John Hume or Ian Paisley themselves were MEPs for so long, play their roles, let's say a training ground for dialogue in a moment where the direct rule was imposed, so there was not a chance to talk really much. So if you can start, they were Eurosceptical at the beginning, both of them, from different perspectives, but how they changed in years and after the peace agreement as well. Thank you.
Okay, well, I suppose Sinn Féin would still be Eurocritical, maybe more than Eurosceptic. It's true that we were against lots of the treaties and would have campaigned against those. We accept that Europe is part of our present and future. And I think what would really change things was Brexit, because Martina Anderson, we had 4 MEPs at that time, Martina and 3 others, Matt Carthy was another one, Lynn Boylan and, this is the menopause, racks my brain for names. But Martina Anderson went round and spoke to every MEP. She produced a little Good Friday Agreement, basically given a summary of the Good Friday Agreement, and went round all the MEPs and said, this is what's going to happen in the island of Ireland. And we've had, I suppose, a long-term relationship with Europe. If you've ever read the 1916 proclamation, it talks about our gallant allies in Europe. And, you know, we talk about the United States and Europe and the importance of that international. And I think Sinn Féin's always been an outward-looking international party. We've had, we've worked with parties like the ANC, with the Basque Country, with the Catalonians, with the Palestinians. We've reached out and we've got involved in learning from other parts of the world and them from us. So I think Europe has been a driver for change for us, and the fact that, you know, a United Ireland, a 32-county United Ireland, all of that will go back into Europe is a big bonus for us as well. But I think you're probably right. John Hume and certainly Ian Paisley would have maybe had to, but the thing about Europe is because you're in those political groupings, you can just spend all your time talking to like-minded people from wherever they are, and that's where you could see the political realignment happening. And we are still part of GUI NGL, or the left in Europe now, and that's how we would see the future developing as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Just
very, very quickly, on the DUP and on Europe, I mean, the DUP's Euroscepticism changed over time. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, Ian Paisley was denouncing the EEC as a Catholic conspiracy, as a Roman Catholic club, which was a problem undetected by just about every other political party across Europe. It changed in the 1990s, and they became an issue of UK national sovereignty. But the DUP was taken by surprise by Brexit. Yes, there were a few DUPers who were gung-ho for Brexit and formed part of the campaign. But I think a lot of them just thought, well, there'll be a Remain vote, it doesn't really matter. And they'd certainly not thought through the implications of Brexit. I remember going to the DUP conference 2016 after the Brexit vote, and the one thing that wasn't mentioned at the party conference was Brexit. And so they just avoided the topic because they hadn't thought through potential implications in terms of the difficult issue of the border on that. It's one other point as well, it's worth remembering that whilst nationalists overwhelmingly voted to remain in the EU, Unionists were more divided. There's about even a third of DUP supporters, if you look at the survey evidence, who actually voted to remain, which is a point that tends to get overlooked quite often. So I just think the DUP had not thought through the implications of Brexit. But yeah, they are Eurosceptic, but it's based upon UK national sovereignty.
Should we move on to it, because we can both talk separately on that? Is that unless you want to say?
Just quickly on that, I'd just say with Sinn Féin in the EU, I think, and I like that, that phrase, like critical. approach in terms of like European integration. You'd see the same from the like 60s, 70s when it was EEC formation with like SNP and Plaid Cymru were the same. And I think because the concern was, what is this? Is this some kind of, if you like, sort of European superstate, or is it an attempt to bring together different nationalities, groups, etc. across Europe? And I think certainly things like, the EU's done quite a lot of work on like minority languages, and I think that would have helped as well. Certainly, just from knowledge that I've applied, that would be important. So that would be my approach. And I think definitely the point about the left, I mean, different left groups in Europe would take, the Sinn Féin's working with in the European Parliament would take that approach as well. And I think because it actually, in a sense, the EU has made borders for members less relevant, and obviously for nationalist parties, etc. That's important. But the left side of Sinn Féin, would see that at times the EU would be seen as more, certainly not having a left agenda on some things. So that'd be my side.
Thank you so much. My name is Bhagwan. I'm a second year PhD student, and I do research on the Northern Ireland conflict. So I have 3 questions, but they're very short. So my first one is, can we say that the Good Friday Agreement is more of a ceasefire than an end to the conflict? My second question is, David Trimble once said that Tony Blair gives too much credit himself for securing the Good Friday Agreement. Do you agree with this statement or disagree? And please explain why. And the third one, how much credit can we give to Bertie Ahern, I'm sorry if I'm reading it correctly, for securing the agreement? That's it. Thank you so much.
Don't know who wants to take.
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yes, in a sense, the ceasefire point, and I think and again, it comes back to barometer, and like the 2 Johns and I would know this with like the academic literature is how much are we expecting from like the Good Friday Agreement and power sharing. And I think that, like, my own personal view on this is, again, I think it has been up and down, as John said, like 60% of the time in existence. But I think that, in a sense, if you look at where we came from, just a simple measure is, the levels of political violence, you look between like 1990 to 1995, now the IRA goes on ceasefire in 1994, but loyalists involved in that as well. And then you look in the early 2000s, there's a dramatic decline in number of people killed because of like political violence. So I think it is a ceasefire, and that's okay. I don't think it's going to like renew conflict. It's a ceasefire to agree to end the armed part of a discussion and debate on the constitutional question. Your second question, too much credit for Tony Blair. Yeah, maybe. I would say what's important in Blair, to be fair, and we talked a little bit about decommissioning today, I think he adopting what Senator Mitchell said and the Independent International Commission on Decommissioning about doing that in parallel, I think was a sensible suggestion. And John Major, I think, set up key parts of the peace agreement, but the whole decommissioning thing, because he was asking for like guns before talks, became a mess. So I think Blair did a good job in sorting that. But I don't think it's like Tony Blair came in and then everybody kind of banged heads together and everyone thought, Blair's right on this. We've got and Bertie Ahern the same. I would say where the Irish government, his predecessors as well, Albert Reynolds, where they were really important. And I think understanding like Irish republicanism with Sinn Féin was the whole thing about self-determination. They understood you couldn't just have a peace settlement where you just say, okay, it's up to Northern Ireland itself to decide whether it's part of the South or not. And unification. They understood that needed to be an all-Ireland decision because it, in a sense, was kind of getting the British government, and from Bertie Ahern's point of view, for Fianna Fáil party at that point, to accept something went wrong in the 1920s and it was right that the people of Ireland had that decision, the British government didn't just carve up the country, etc. Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Wagner, great questions. Thank you so much. I suppose the GFA helped us to come to an end of physical force republicanism. And we accept, and in our analytics of conflicts around the world, when there's a conflict, there will be a political debate and discussion and settlement at the end of it. So, you go from armed struggle to a political struggle and then hopefully into peace. So we always knew that's the trajectory. So, and that's where we wanted to be. And John, I think, said it earlier. Yes, we never wanted to prolong the armed conflict. And we'd have preferred never to have an armed conflict. The British government took the war close to our streets and towns and townlands. So it wasn't that we were, mad for a bloody war. Blair, yes, I do think gives himself a lot of credit, but there was a very interesting dynamic and relationship between him and Bertie Ahern. And it is worth noting that within weeks, and the political scientists will have the statistics more than me, within weeks of Blair becoming the British Prime Minister, we were in Downing Street. I was at the first meeting in number 10 Downing Street since Michael Collins. So I was also, just for the people who don't know me, Countess Markievicz was the first woman who was elected to the British House of Commons, the first woman MP, and she was a Sinn Féin MP, and I was the second Sinn Féin MP. So that's sort of the history of that. But Blair definitely would have given himself a right bit of credit, but he had us in Downing Street. And I remember in his opening remarks that day, at the cabinet table, he said, I don't think we'll see a united Ireland in the lifetime of the youngest person in this room. And that was me, and I was 28. And Gerry Adams responded in his opening remarks and said, if somebody had said to me 10 years ago that we would be sitting in number 10 Downing Street at the cabinet table with the British Prime Minister, the leader of the Labour Party, with your majority, I'd have said not in my lifetime too. And Blair just went, touche, you know? So he got us into Downing Street, and he took us more seriously probably, and took us, you know, than any other previous British Prime Minister. Bertie Ahern too. Bertie Ahern, you probably don't know this, and Bertie, oh my God, there could never be enough books written about Bertie Ahern and his unique personality. But one of the things, Bertie worked really hard to get the Good Friday Agreement over the line as well. And the stars were aligned with just the personalities that were in place. But Bertie Ahern left his mother's funeral to come back up the road to Belfast as part of the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement. That's the level of commitment that was given to some of those players within that. And I think without that, and certainly we have not seen that commitment when we got a Tory government, I'm telling you now, the interest and the will and the drive to fix things in the north of Ireland disappeared like Snovoditch with the Tory party. And we certainly were much better off previously with Labour, not so sure with Keir Starmer, but there was a big difference in the prioritisation of what we were still working towards.
I'd echo what we've heard from both other speakers, so I genuinely will be brief here. I agree, great questions as well, yeah. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, was it a ceasefire? Yeah, it's a conflict management measure in a lot of ways rather than conflict resolution measure, because it doesn't resolve the constitutional conflict. That will always be there, this side of a united Ireland and possibly beyond. Yeah. On Tony Blair getting too much credit, no, I don't think he got too much credit. He deserves a lot of credit. And it was interesting last week in Downing Street where Keir Starmer, admittedly we'd all had a lot of Guinness at this stage, but Keir Starmer said, the greatest achievement of the Labour Party in my lifetime was the Good Friday Agreement. Now you can say, was it a Labour Party achievement? You know, but I think it was an important thing for Keir Starmer to say and acknowledge the effort that went into it. And, you know, to echo Michelle's comments, the amount of effort that Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern put in, you know, Bertie Ahern on that moving morning when he comes up straight up after his funeral. I mean, I'm not sure that other politicians these days would necessarily devote that level of time. You've got to remember, Tony Blair was told, forget it, you know, there is no solution, forget it, don't bother with it, don't touch it, and there's no votes in it, not a single vote for the Labour Party in the north of Ireland. So for him to devote so much time when the work, we can be cynical about Blair for sure, but there were no votes in it for him. And I think that is a testimony to the effort he put in.
I've got 3 questions. One question that's more straight out. Sorry if the point's already been briefly covered. So there goes, why did Sinn Féin go into the peace agreement? What was their mindset? What was their goals? And do you agree with the stalemate thesis?
Should we go to one more question? I think does anyone else have their hand up? Yes, go on.
I have a question about in Ireland's history there are many conflicts, but I'm a bit curious that even if these conflicts, but its economy grows. So as far as I know, I think the institutional and political stability is a significant precondition for the economic growth. So I'm a bit curious about this situation. Why conflicts, but the economic growth?
Yeah. Does anybody want to? You can take either question, but where do you want to start with Sinn Féin?
Do you want to go first, John, this time?
Just on the stalemate thesis, that's an interesting one because, yeah, all the academic literature on peace processes, yeah, they often result from, you know, mutually hurting stalemate and ripeness. Does that explain the timing of peace? I think that I'm not so sure. We've got a world-leading expert here on the state of the IRA and whether how penetrated it was. Okay, we've got a leading expert who knows where Sinn Féin was at during that period. So perhaps they're better off answering this. I think in some ways there had been a stalemate since the 1980s. I understand why the IRA was calling 1972 year of victory. If you bring down a Unionist regime that had lasted 50 years within 2 years of an IRA campaign, you probably do think you're winning at that point. But it was obvious by the late 70s, if not earlier, that a political movement would have to be developed, and for Republicans to get something politically, they needed a political arm because military strength was not going to bring it. So I'd argue stalemate had existed quite a long time before the Good Friday Agreement. The British Army was quite candid, some of the senior figures in the British Army, that they couldn't defeat the IRA. So yes, it was a stalemate, but I think it was a stalemate long before the Good Friday Agreement. So it's a slightly caveated reply. Why did Sinn Féin do it? Well, let's hear directly, I think, is probably my get out on that. On economic growth, very briefly. Yeah, I mean, economic growth did matter. I mean, conditions in the north were improving. I think, certainly for the minority community, which had suffered, a lot of economic discrimination, and that was a contributory factor, I think, in there were lots of other factors, but it was a contributory factor, I think, to the moves towards peace.
Okay, well, I suppose I'll try and answer this as quickly as I can. And again, both great questions, and as was yours, we didn't say that earlier. So, during the 800-year history of Ireland and our relationship with our nearest neighbour, they tried to decimate. The British tried to take our language off us. They very nearly did. They tried to, we were almost, Catholicism was nearly driven out during the penal times, and we still have, you go around Ireland and there's villages and the chapel is 2 miles out of the village because you weren't allowed to build it in the town and all sorts of things. So the things that were important to Irish people, the indigenous population in Ireland, the Brits tried to strip a lot of that away. Partition failed people, and the growing up in the 1900s, in the 1900s wasn't a great period. In 1968, my parents were involved in an eviction in Caledon. You basically, if you had a house or if you had property, you had a vote. If you had 4 properties, you had 4 votes. If you had no property, you had no votes. And that was housing was used as a really blunt tool to disenfranchise nationalists. My aunt came home from England, tried to get a house for her, her husband, and 2 children. She's pregnant with her 3rd, couldn't get a house. The Brantry Republican Club, the precursor to the Sinn Féin common structure, Brantry Republican Club negotiated with the council and tried to get houses built in the Brantry. They wouldn't build them where I live because it was deemed to be too nationalist. They said they'd build houses in Caledon, about 4 or 5 miles away from where I grew up. 15 houses were built. They were supposed to be allocated 7 to Catholics and 8 to Protestants. When the allocations were done, the only Catholic family who got a house was a man who was in the British Army. And my aunt, who by then had 3 children, was denied a house, and the girl who got the house that she thought she was getting was a single Unionist girl who worked for the local Unionist politician. And that's how we were treated back 6 years ago. Ireland was not a good place for nationalist families growing up. My parents would have been very political. My grandparents were very political. And the squatting, the eviction, the squatting in Caledon, so they squatted in the house for months and they were eventually evicted. And we had to take matters into our own hands as a family. I wasn't born, just before any of you say anything. I wasn't born at the time. But that's how Then I got elected in 2001, and a commentator said about the Caledon situation, and he said, Michelle Gildernew has now been elected as a member of the House of Commons. And he said, let that sink in. It's a pity the Gildernews didn't get the House. Because by being denied a home and a roof over our head, we were nearly, not forced, but we were certainly encouraged into political activism. And I think that is an example. And like I said earlier, we never wanted a conflict, we never wanted to be involved in a war, but the British government took a bloody war to us. And things like the hunger strike and how our prisoners were treated, things like the murder triangle in the 1970s when lots and lots of innocent Catholics in my community were murdered, issues like collusion, shoot to kill, all of those things, we have not, as an Irish Republican, we have not been treated well by successive British governments. And we have to bring about a situation in Ireland where conflict is no more. We have no desire to be involved in conflict. We're very wedded to our neutrality position on a global stage. As an Irish woman, I've seen enough conflict to do me a lifetime. I would love to see there never been another conflict anywhere in the world, because I think it's a game for men where women and children are killed and lives are destroyed. So we've seen enough conflict. We want to see a situation where Ireland can flourish, where we can bring about a proper peace, and where we can take our place on the world stage without the cancer of partition hanging over us. So that's what I'll be working at to the day I die, is about bringing about the right for the Irish people to make their own decisions without having to rely on our neighbours to make those for us for good, bad or indifferent.
Okay, my response, you'll know this from class, so it won't be any different. I don't think the IRA or Sinn Féin's forcing the peace because of informers or anything like that. I think, ultimately as well, so I do agree with the stalemate thesis, with the caveat that I think that the Republican leadership, I think it was the same in the 70s, but particularly Adams and McGuinness and others later, once you get into the 80s and 90s, were aiming for like a negotiated settlement. And I think that, therefore, when you look what happens by 98, that is actually achieved. They get a negotiated settlement. They're included in talks. I don't think that's, that's not the same as, say, if some authors are saying, therefore Adams in the 80s, he's looking to get Stormont, and that's what the settlement they're looking for is. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think the ambition was more the IRA persists, which I think it did, to not escalate but persists. You try and increase Sinn Féin's vote, then you have a kind of political and armed pressure, and then you see what you get. And obviously you want to try and get maximum concessions. And I think that, then there's a question, and I think they're able to do that, and that's why I think there was peace talks. Why then, particularly like 94, why 98, why stop at that point? I think the Downing Street Declaration was key, because of the fact, again, the British government had conceded the right of the people of Ireland, north and south, to have a say over its future, which the British government wouldn't have a say on, other than our point that they actually do have a say, because no one thought at the time about, well, hang on a minute, what's the conditions they have to call the vote, which I think was a little bit of an oversight from the Good Friday Agreement. But nonetheless, so I think that's why they end up in the peace process. And like, if you look at like Gerry Adams' work, would say that's not exactly what they want, because of the fact that they don't want a vote north and south. It would be better just have an all-Ireland vote. But that's for the movement, that's an important goal, self-determination conceded. There's a paper in the National Archives, and this is one of the priests who's having back-channel talks with Gerry Adams. He says this to the British government, that this was in like early 1994, and he says they will stop because the Downing Street Declaration has conceded the point of Irish self-determination, which was a key point in the Republicans' campaign. On the question about economy, I think what's interesting with economy as well, just for studying this, John would know this when we teach, like, Thatcherism, right, in Northern Ireland. So if you look in, like, England, Scotland, Wales, it was like no public sector and lots of cuts on private industry. But in Northern Ireland, they just poured more and more money into the public sector. So even under Thatcher, because there was a belief that if you did that, it would stop people being involved in conflict, which obviously was not actually how it worked out. But and I think at the moment it's an interesting situation, like we were saying with the Irish unity debate, because the Republic of Ireland economy is doing well. Within the EU, and kind of the post-COVID benefits for their economy, which might not be the position for what we can see at the moment for the whole of the UK. So I think that might be significant going forward when there's debates about Irish unity. Yeah, but good questions. Thank you for the questions.
I might supplement that, because part of what I do is that side of Northern Ireland and the sort of political economy of it. I think Europe is really important within that. Both Britain and Ireland joining the European Union, or EEC, was so important as far as the sort of the transfer of wealth into through regional funds and social funds to the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and that we can see that through the peace process, the peace dividend, the kind of the funding. But it's really important, I think, for both politically. You're talking about political and economic and social aspects. I think politically it was important that Ireland was able to, in a sense, throw its own weight in Europe. That it was growing, that it was and now obviously per capita it's richer than Britain. But it's important as you go through that process. Did you want to come in?
I'd like to actually what I would like to ask is there any specific politic for contributes to the economic growth during that time?
Were there any, sorry,
Is there any political
policies? Yeah.
Policies,
Yeah.
And during that time, that contributed
To the peace process and
contributed to the economic growth.
do you want to come in?
I'm not sure.
Well, Thomas mentioned it. I mean, Thatcher suspended Thatcherism for Northern Ireland, and money was pumped in. And then you had the EU peace money. You also had the American government underwriting the cost of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and you had a lot of European Union peace money put in the 1990s, which...
I think there were promises. There's promises for more money, right? If there's peace in Northern Ireland, or peace in the north of Ireland and Ireland, then there's a sense that, particularly I think from Washington, that there will be investment, there'll be more growth, and clearly you'd had 30 odd years of violence and not investment. So not just about inward investment, but actually about entrepreneurship. So the incentive for peace was clear, because the incentive was that you'd get economic growth out of that you're not blowing up, city centres.
And also then the most up-to-date example of that would be the Shared Ireland Fund, which is an Irish government initiative, and it is helping to fund infrastructure projects and other things in the north. So a bridge has been built between Omeath and Warrenpoint, and the Irish government are paying for that. They've paid for parts of the Ulster Canal. They're investing in roads and investing in infrastructure, and that's probably a softener, a sweetener for some people as well, but it's a very useful pot of money in very stringent economic times.
Yeah, so when I was living in Northern Ireland through that Good Friday Agreement period, and I was part of a business network from 98, 99, and I was talking with people who were Unionists and whether they were balancing that, whether they'd vote for the Good Friday Agreement, and the economic factors were really important within that. and cross-border as well. There were cross-border initiatives between, I was studying at Queen's, and I was also studying at Trinity at the same time, doing a business degree, and they were talking about how that cross-border, I went to Dundalk. There's a college in Dundalk, and they were talking about how they could bring inward investment into Northern Ireland. So it was really, really important. It's a really good question, because it's really important to how the peace was brought about. Because there's different sectors in society, right? It's not all just working class, middle class. So, there's different levels, and you've got to try and convince everybody that peace is a good thing. So yeah. Right, should we? I bet we would call it a day, I guess. Right, so I guess just to say thank you to the panel. Usual kind of way to give them a clap to say thanks very much. Thanks very much all of you for turning up. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.